All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to my channel. I'm Justice Graves, and I am the host of the Justice Graves YouTube channel. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on Locals. Please go to my Locals if it is not already in the description. It is somewhere. It's everywhere. It's justicegraves.locals.com, and we're just going to get started. So, well, you know what? I'm not going to actually get started completely right away. We're going to wait a few seconds, do a little bit more of a longer intro to this because we are talking about, again, it's honestly my least favorite topic. We're going to be talking about the Education Stabilization Fund with respect to the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. We're talking about the Massachusetts ARP ESSER Plan. And oh boy, do I have so many feelings about this. If you like this kind of content, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And please stay for, and watch some of the other videos on this content that I've done. So let's kind of review a little bit on my background because I have many feelings about the documents that I'm going to show you today. And there's a few reasons why, and one of them, and key point, is that I live in this state, so I kind of see ins and outs a little bit more up close and personal. I also saw it more up close and personal because this isn't the first time that I've read this plan. It's the first time I've read it online, and it's the first time I've actually gone through most of the links in it. What I'm talking about is I've gone through this document because I was on a local school committee up until, I think it's almost been 5 months, but we're approaching the 5-month mark since I've sort of been gone from that, thank goodness. And I saw this up close and personal in our preparation as a school committee to vote on what our ARP ESSER plan would be. ARP ESSER being the third aid package due to the coronavirus pandemic that schools received. The first one being the CARES Act package, which introduced the ESSER, and the second one, which is the CRRSA, which introduced ESSER 2 monies. ESSER stands for Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief, and that is the funding by which a lot of elementary and secondary education schools get their funding through the state through these programs. If you're in colleges, you're getting HEER money. If you are the government itself administering it, you are using funds out of the GEER. And if you are a non-public entity, starting with the second round of money that came out with the CRRSA, we are talking about the EAN fund that is within the ESF. And it's an alphabet soup, but what we're talking about today is ARPA money. We're talking exclusively about ARPA money for schools. That's something that you really got to get through. So, what are we talking about when it comes to ARPA money? What I'm going to walk you through first of all, this is Massachusetts. We went through New Hampshire the last time, and I've covered Arizona. Arizona is a red state. Arizona had a lot of woke stuff in their plans for professionals and for their plans in the ARP ESSER plans. Quite frankly, it was very obvious if you looked through everything. When we went over New Hampshire, we talked about stakeholder groups, and that was something that I really wanted to point out on this round. Stakeholder groups are basically whichever favorable, and finally, this is sort of catching on a little bit. I think a lot of people are just realizing this at the exact same time, thank goodness. Stakeholder groups are groups that the district brings in for feedback, but they're usually groups that are very close with the administration that get sort of sucked in. Or that are close with state administrations and get sucked into that feedback process. So it's more of a loop of basically it's biased feedback. It's basically if I were to go out onto the street and I select somebody who walks like me, talks like me, and I say, hey, do you think that what's going on in public education right now is a good thing? They're most likely, if I choose someone that thinks like me, walks like me, talks like me, sort of has the same concepts, and I purposely select them, and I select, let's say, 10 of those exact same people, well, that's a bias study. We've been talking about bias studies for the past 2 years for a lot of different reasons. A lot of it having to do with medical, a lot of it having to do with political feedback, but This happens in education as well. So that is something that you should keep in mind. We are now going to go through, I think I've had enough of the build-up. What I am going to do is bring onto the screen, we're going to kind of go through this one step at a time. Where are you? Sharing screen. I'm getting a little bit better at this. Massachusetts ARP ESSER. Highlights PDF. Allow. Is it going up on the screen? There we go. Haha. All right, so we're just going to get started here. So the Massachusetts ARP ESSER state highlights. So the highlights, if you remember from every time we've talked about this, are almost equivalent. They are not the official press release that each state put out, but these are the official main sticking points that the state likes to basically brag about. So this is basically the state talking about its own plan and its own words that it's bragging about with the federal government. Think about it in terms of that sort of perspective. The top priorities, we have, this is Massachusetts. We have already hit the key terms: culturally responsive support, which we all know is, CRT, culturally responsive teaching, culturally, critical race theory. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. This is Massachusetts. It's a woke state. I can tell you up close and personal that it is a woke state, but by and golly. We go a little bit down. We look at all the wonderful state highlights, blah, blah, blah. We pick out another one. This is sort of something that I really want to highlight. Back when I was on the school committee, I knew about SEL, but I didn't really know a lot about how to sort of find it in these legal documents or these documents that these legal entities were putting out. And a lot of Massachusetts has a lot of centralized systems. So we have a centralized sort of way that we assess attendance that gets reported to the state on an individual by individual student basis. We get tested year round, and that gets directly put to the state, and they know about us. Massachusetts is a centralized agency, state agency that focuses on its education. And this particular sentence is really important because it covers multiple issues here. And we're talking about the SEL, and we're talking about, practicing psychology without a license. And if we're talking about, well, not just psychology, but we're talking psychiatry without a license. And if we're talking about, the issue of privacy, this sentence here: in addition to assessment results, DESE will review data on chronic absenteeism. They already do that. Student enrollment and attendance, they have a centralized system for that. Advanced course completion, student discipline. We'll talk about what's going on with discipline later on. Student and educator surveys. This, when I had read it back when I was on school committee, didn't strike me as odd because we didn't go over SEL stuff, and I didn't see it at the school level yet until, basically the meeting where we talked about ESSER. But this should be a red flag. You see the word survey, you need to start investigating a little bit. As we saw with the 603 Bright Futures survey in New Hampshire, this is kind of how this stuff is flying by the radar. And when I mean survey, we're talking about SEL stuff. And data from the early warning indicator system, this is sort of baked in with MCAS. If you don't know what MCAS is, count yourself lucky. MCAS is basically our statewide system of review to make sure that students are on task for their learning outcomes. Then we go a little bit down here. Community engagement and consultation. I'm sure there's other stuff that we should be worried about in here, but it's not the stuff that pops up that really needs to sort of be hammered home. In developing its plan, DESE met with over 50 stakeholder groups. What they're not going to tell you is, and they do actually have a list of the 50 stakeholder groups that they sort of do meet with. Most of these state plans, when we actually get into it, do tell us this. But what they're not going to tell you is that most of these stakeholder groups, if not all of them, are associations of either unions or associations that are mandated at the state level that do get state funding. So, of course, if you are a group who is involved in feedback, who gets stakeholder funding, well, let's call it stakeholder funding, but that gets state money, are you going to bite the hand that feeds you? No. So you're just going to perpetuate some of the bad ideas, and this is how this whole cycle of bad education sort of evolves. And then they're going to keep evaluating stakeholder feedback. like I said, I can't hammer this home enough. Stakeholders are people favorable to the district who will say no wrong in a completely biased light. And when I say will speak no wrong, I mean they're not going to generate negative press that's going to ruin them. You can say aggressive stuff in those meetings and you can push for certain things, but it's got to look progressive for the district. It's got to look like you're pushing forward. So that's sort of what we're looking at. All right, let me get off of here. Remove this from the screen. Stop sharing. We are going to look at the next document, which is sort of the meat of all of this. Share screen. Where are you? Mozilla Firefox. Here we go. Now we're going to get into it. And this is going to be pretty bad. So the state plan for the American Rescue Plan Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, also known as ESSER. It was issued in April when this particular document was created. So this is the interesting part. So and this is just so that you can kind of keep track. When you read each of these, each state responded in a different way. For some reason, and I have no idea why Massachusetts thought this was a great idea, because it really messes up my eyesight, is they decided that they would respond. In the New Hampshire one, we saw that the questions that the government was asking were in blue in the document, and then the state would respond in black Georgia print or black Times New Roman print. In the Massachusetts one, they have decided to flip that, where most, but not all, of the coloring you see in here that is blue is language from the state, and the black is from the federal government, except for, no, this is all from the federal government. The blue stuff is what the state added in. Signed on June 7th, 2021. This is the question from the United States Department of Education. And this is the state's question. Or this is not the state's question, this is the state's focus. We're going to kind of just jump right into it. I did not get to go through all 61 pages of this document. Thank God. Because quite frankly, Massachusetts is woke and we know it is. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that. You don't have to look very far, but we're on page 4. Between page 4 and 5, and with the links here, you're just going to already shake your head and say this is not good already. First of all, I have feelings about this first page that I really want to put out because of their response 1 for health and safety. They created this system of pool testing, which I'm going to just tell you right now, I sat in the meeting to explain, not necessarily the pool testing, but to explain the test and stay process. It was multiple, and I'm a school committee member at that time, mind you, multiple pages with flow chart. And listen, I like me a good flow chart. I like to know what's going on. I like to know a good logic tree. I like to see how things are going. But this was a document for the entire community to try and understand a process that they've never had to revolve their lives around. And to be quite frank, it wasn't good. Just kind of sitting there for a 40 or 50-minute briefing on this with a lot of information that wasn't repeated and quite honestly a lot of concern about. I knew I was concerned about the confusion, and boy, did it play out on Facebook really quickly in the beginning of the school year with the level of confusion that went on. But I have feelings about this because honestly, it has been, I think, one of the most it has been driving the anxiety of parents for months in this state with the test and stay program with the pool testing approach. And it's just, and it takes a lot of effort for these approaches to work with the existing school staff, which a lot of this is, I'm going to say it, it is distracting from the fact that school nurses are not supposed to be doing stuff like this 24/7. They have to actually attend to the medical needs of the individual students that they're supposed to serve. And this is a gigantic amount of time. And this has come out in state, in district by district across the state, that this has absorbed people's ability to handle other situations in the district. So, not going to call this a great approach. It definitely, it's a time sucker in a lot of ways that, quite frankly, are not helpful. Focus on academics and equity. You can already see that I've highlighted this. So they're already talking about equity in their response and how they're going to start using some of this money. They have the Massachusetts Literacy Guide. I'm not going to click on that and look at that for you. But then there's also continuing deep learning. And I had to take a step back when I saw this terminology a few times, and it didn't like click because they use a lot of terminology like deep learning, deep this, advanced, whatever. And at the surface, you're like, okay, whatever, it's just fancy branding. And then a few months before I ended my stint on school committee, I had wanted to do some research, but I just didn't have the time on something called the Kaleidoscope program or the Kaleidoscope Collective. And I wanted to do some research on what's called the Calculus Project. I still need to kind of go back and look at the Calculus Project, but this now finally answers my question, what is the Kaleidoscope Collective? Because I didn't look at this before online. I had printed it out and I had scanned through as a school committee member to get where the money sections were to understand how I was supposed to apply the monies. If you click on this and we go all the way over, I'm going to put this in a different window. And I'm actually going to, I'm going to share it in a minute. Let's stop screen share. Let's share screen. Streamyard, Kaleidoscope Collective, allow. All right. If we look at the Kaleidoscope Collective for learning, we're going to get an answer to what is deep learning. Because if you look back at that document, I'm like, what is deep learning? So let's click on it and let's see what deep learning is. If we look at what deep learning is, it is a student's demonstration of mastery, identity, and creativity. Mastery is evident when all students develop the knowledge or skills outlined in the standards of practices, which is, we're talking state standards here, and the ability to transfer that knowledge across situations. Identity. And this is where things kind of get a little bad. And by a little, I mean really bad. Is evident when all students become more invested in the discipline by thinking of themselves as active agents who do that kind of work. What does that mean? It is a shift in thinking from saying that they are learning about something to that they are the thing. This was happening a lot more, and you see it in the programs for educational materials where it's like, let your little biologists or let your little engineers work things out. Now listen, if the students are actually constructing something and they're in a competition or something, you could call them an engineering competition team. You could absolutely start to describe them in a certain way. But does learning about first grade biology, or I don't even know if they learn anything about biology in first grade. It's been such a long time. And remember, my thing is more government than education. If we're talking about biology, and I'm a first grader, and I'm learning about it, and I have no mastery over anything, even at a high level, does that make me a biologist? And the answer is no. This is collectivist ideology, and this is also something that James Lindsay sort of brings to the forefront, that what the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education is doing in this instance, and they are applying this deeper learning, it's an ideology across all platforms, is that if you are learning about the thing, then you are the thing. that is not how that works. I can read as much as I want about education, but I'm not an educator. That's what Deb does. I think even Sloan has some experiences and stuff. So that's what Sloan does. That's what other people do. That's what the people, that's what Paul Rossi does. They are educators. I am not. I read and I learn about education stuff through my government activities. But I am not an educator. And that is something that people need to understand now. People could say, well, Justice, you're a little bit of a teacher. That's fine, but I don't do the kind of material lessons that people such as them do. I'm not even somebody who has the experience to say that I am a counselor and I am an educator like somebody like Aaron Kinsvatter would, or another type of person. That's just not who I am. So I just want to be very clear that there is a very big difference. I don't think I articulated that quite correctly. The reason why I am not those things is because I understand things at a level where I can't, just because I am trying to understand social emotional learning, and I understand it enough that I can pick up where these things are and go to these links and find this stuff. I can't translate social emotional learning except outside of a few very good analogies to the average observer or to the average audience member that I talk to in this community or on this channel. I can't reach that. Deb can. People like Sloan can do that. That's not my thing. But what I can do, and this is outside of some really good analogies, I can tell you and show you my step-by-step thought process for how to find where stuff is and to be skeptical in an appropriate manner to observe what this stuff is and to grab a hold of it and then to go look at what other people are doing to get a better grasp of the situation. But that doesn't make me an educator on education, and it doesn't make me a biologist either. And honestly, I have half a mind. She's taking a little bit of a break from the internet this weekend to ask a climate scientist that I know, when did you become a climate scientist? Did you become a scientist back when you were studying it at the beginning of your process in college, or was it at a different time? So I think that's something people really need to keep in mind. But here's the other part that's like really, really messed up. Educators affirm students' cultural and racial heritage and leverage their funds of knowledge, experiences, and interests. This is critical race theory on steroids. Now, it's not as bad. Actually, I shouldn't say that. It's probably just about on point with New York's plan. And New York's plan is not only a state plan of equity, of racial equity, it's a state plan of racial equity that's also trademarked by the state. So the state owns that trademark of whatever the program is. It actually has the word equity in it. It's wild. They promote it basically throughout their entire ARP ESSER plan. I've seen quite enough of it in there that I don't even want to talk about it. Deb has gotten into it from like side to side and hit into it at certain points. She doesn't cover the whole thing, but she's hit side to side on what New York is doing. It's a bad program, and it's hard to explain all of the ins and outs of that. But I mean, come on. What does affirming students' cultural and racial heritage have anything to do with learning about biology? Okay. Well, you know what? What does culture have to do with learning about biology? I mean, seriously. Leverage their funds of knowledge. This is just verbose. This is just overly verbose. And their individual experiences have nothing to do with certain undeniable facts proven through the scientific method. Now, their interests are important. If they're invested, you want to encourage that fostering, that deeper fostering of inquiry, that deeper fostering of skepticism appropriately. But this is just predatory, is the way that I would describe this. Creativity is evident when all students shift from receiving knowledge of a discipline to acting or making something within the discipline, blah, blah, blah. Draws roughly from, look at this. Deeper learning is Culturally responsive teaching. There's a continuum. And including students of color. And if you have a really hard time and you don't want to read all the fancy words, you just have to put purpose, problem, product, and critically all together into, this Venn diagram at the top, shove it in. I mean, literally. I mean, this is this is actually the perfect photo to explain how just absolutely messed up this is. Shove it into this black box of equity for all through deeper learning. This black box, as you will, this sort of machine. They're not telling you what's really in it. And then out pops off this mastery, identity, and creativity. And that intersection in this Venn diagram is where all that comes together. I think this is just the perfect example of how they shove things through a meat grinder. How they should, think of this as like making the sausage. And once you know what this deeper learning thing, and they tell you, it draws directly from research on culturally responsive teaching. Well, if it's drawing directly from it, I think it's fair to say appropriately that it is CRT, which we know from actually reading the book on CRT. I know that James Lindsay and them have done stuff like this where they've looked at critically responsive teaching on other teachers. I don't think he's looked at critically responsive teaching, but other people have looked at actually the book on critically responsive teaching that a lot of the New England states are using to base all this stuff off of. And it is, in fact, CRT. It's just the education version of it. So we know what is making the sausage in this machine. It is absolute garbage that is going into the sausage as filler, and then getting less sausage when you get out. Actually, I would pose that since these are all different colors, except for the center here, that you're putting in perfectly good meat into the machine, and what's getting shoved out is artificial fake lab meat, Frankenstein's monster. I think that's a good way to put it, because there's no other way to describe this. This is just the epitome of how messed up this is. And if you want to look at more stuff, deeper learning tasks. Oh, it's just, ladies and gentlemen, remember, we're on page 5 of the actual document that we still need to get back to, and I'm not doing this for more than an hour. So deeper understanding requires both a significant repository of factual knowledge and the ability to use that factual knowledge. Oh my God. Standards aligned curriculum, state standard aligned curriculum. I mean, and then of course their definition of critically is educators and students not only engage with resources from diverse perspectives. You can, I mean, this is Massachusetts. Take a quick guess what they actually mean there, because it's not positive. I went on another channel, and I might have to do this again on this channel just to sort of make the point. I went over what was in the State Department and the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education in Massachusetts' superintendent evaluation form, and they discuss what they mean by diversity quite a bit at the forefront of it, so that you can properly evaluate your superintendent going through. It basically is, it's based on race, and it's based off of immutable characteristics that have nothing to do with your ability to think. It's pretty gross, and quite frankly, when I get back to the document, there's a point where I'm really going to sort of hammer home my feelings on what the state is doing right now. Who is excluded? What social narratives are preserved? This is, so when they talk about critically, they often intersect critically with skeptical. And what I really want to point here is, this is when they're going to say this is the skeptical or the critical part of it. Preserving those narratives. They want people to analyze who is centered. So basically, who is in control. Whiteness is centered, centering on whiteness. Who is excluded. Who is the minority group in the situation. What social narratives are preserved. Notice as nothing, narratives. Let me just say this. Narrative begins with an N. if you see it in a document that's supposed to be about education, you know, narrative or something about to do with the government, and people aren't going to like that I say this, narratives equal nothing. Narratives are nothing. It's not information. It's not data. There may be information and data within it, but narratives are nothing. You need to see the actual thing that itself for it to actually mean anything, and especially in these types of programs, it's just a total manipulation. What narratives are preserved basically is whiteness preserved, is another way of putting it. And the purpose of preserving those narratives, how are you preserving the white state of being, or how are you preserving the systemic racism? This maps really closely with critical race theory. These exact. It's more of a critical social justice way that they're sort of describing it here, and it's more akin to cynical theories, like if you break down the postmodernism in it. But this is exclusively postmodernist. This is like their version of skeptical. Critically is their version of skeptical, and they mix the two a lot and they interchange the words. But actually being skeptical, this is not actually being skeptical. And then I have another horrible document. This was updated not that long ago. Professional opportunities, our schools. We're not going to look into that. Something that I want to poke fun at, and it's just sort of for my entertainment, as opposed to yours, is they redid the symbol for the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education several times. And this one has the star on it. And I get it, but what I'm sort of was laughing about was I remembered this symbol, and I said, where have I seen something similar to this from my childhood? Because it wasn't this. This wasn't DESE's symbol back in the day, or DESE's logo. But this is actually the phonics program that my mother used to teach me how to read, because she was struggling with how to do that because she herself struggles with reading. And I turned out fine, clearly. But I just, it was like tripping me out, blast from the past. Like it's almost as if, because they don't, here's the thing. Phonics has everything to go with going into the science of reading. And I know the older editions of this program are really good because I like to look back on the old versions of it to see how they did. Oh, it used to have the cassette tapes. We still have the cassette tapes downstairs, but I don't think they work anymore. I used to play it on loop. It was, honestly, it's probably embarrassing that I'm admitting this live on, YouTube, but whatever. But they don't teach science of reading or encourage it at the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education level. This is probably a good time to tell you, I don't get any money from sponsoring this, but if you should probably go and invest in a phonics program to teach your kids how to actually read. You don't need to do the app version of this. When I did it, it was cassette tapes. So my recommendation is get away from this stuff and go more towards the physical mediums. And as somebody that does a lot of programming, I will tell you sometimes I have to print out something to really get into it. It is not a good idea to just keep staring at the screen. And it's not a good idea to learn exclusively through a screen. Your retention rate is so much worse. So if you actually want to teach your kids phonics, please just do what you got to do. They also have a hooked on spelling program. Do not prioritize spelling over phonics with your little ones. Prioritize phonics, for the love of God. They need to learn how to read. All right, we are gonna get off of the screen sharing. Oopsie daisies, what am I doing? Oh, no, that is not the issue. We are gonna get off of that, and we're gonna go back into the horrible, the bad, the ugly Massachusetts ARP ESSER State Plan. And so that was just, we're on page 5, the beginning of page 5. It's been 30 minutes of just awful nonsense. There's other stuff in here. I really don't want to go over this. because it's more on a state-by-state basis and it doesn't highlight the really big issues that we really need to sort of focus on in here. This issue, their plan number 3 of everyone's got to go back to in-person learning. This was heavily debated in the state, and they actually were debating reversing this step several times. The Board of Elementary and Secondary Education did. I'm going to go later into it to describe some other stuff that happened. But when I was on school committee locally, but oh boy. We want to foster a sense of belonging and partnership among students and families utilizing this money. While almost 100% of schools are almost back open, there were waivers, some bigger schools that had issues with being able to go back to an in-person learning situation, were exempt. They have rebranded and made it trendier, just like critically responsive teaching. They have made learning loss sexy and appealing by calling it unfinished learning. We didn't use this back when we did not use the term unfinished learning. Apparently, this is something that the state must be pushing that nobody's really been picking up on because it just hasn't been grappling. I can't imagine why this has not been trending well. About how students are just, they're not learning everything that they should within a semester, and they got to do all these extra, continuing education programs, all this after school stuff, blah, blah, blah. They have called it unfinished learning. So just be aware. Between the deeper learning and the unfinished learning, I think what you really need to start grasping when you get into these woker states and as we go through is that, like, postmodernists manipulate language. Do not fall for what they're saying. You got to trace it back and say, what do they actually mean? And when you understand that meaning, you got to throw it out. They really do speak from a linguistic standpoint, and I'm honestly surprised. I know Helen Puckrose has pretty much been trying to duck out of the scene for a while now because of her mental health, but I would love to see an actual principled linguist sort of go through and describe what's happening here. Because I think we're struggling with this, and I don't think that the people who are associated with FAIR are really helping in that regard. I understand there's a few linguists over there, but there's just not really any supportive material that's coming out to sort of go through all of this, blah, 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 blah. We go down. This is the state's question, and this is this is the federal government's question, and this is the state answering it in blue. They call social emotional learning, I think this is a typo, socio-emotional. Well, I would call it sociopathic in some of the questions that they start to ask and the way that they go about it. And also, equity is the main goal of our work. We must differentiate our supports, and therefore we offer different things. And this is where I'm going to tell you right now, I find this next section of stuff that they're talking about to be some of the most racist and sexist that could be discussed. And the first comes from here. The federal government uses the terms racial and ethnic backgrounds. And DESE consistently in this document and consistently in all of their new work since 2020 and 2021, from what I can tell, describes it as across lines of racial difference. They don't like to call it background. They call it racial difference. I kind of hate this term. In my opinion, it's extremely racist because people can be of different races and you can have the same life experiences. And so while I don't like the federal government, saying racial and ethnic background is more appropriate and is more specific. This is just flat out saying that if there is race, there is a difference. And that's not true, and there's a lot of data to back this up. I'm not going to go into that. There are plenty of other people who go into how race doesn't always, and quite frankly, most of the time doesn't play into certain things. It can be manipulated to make it look as such anecdotal and sort of make it with these anecdotal claims that we see all the time. But But that's not true in all cases, and DESE likes to assert that a lot in this document. I need to look at what the Influence 100 and Inspired Fellowships are. They're not linked in this particular section of the document, but they're right next to the Diversity Network, and I've seen a little of the work of the Diversity Network, and it's not good. And then they talk about how for each gender, they're going to do specifically different things. And there's 3 sections and it's not for transgender students. They specifically highlight non-binary, boys, girls, and non-binary, which I'm surprised because the state usually doesn't do. Honestly, I'm surprised at the state level that they did that, because usually, and I'm not certain how they're, you know what? I'm not going to get into it because I would be speculating and that's not going to help. But basically, they have a specific special. It's fascinating because in the girls section, they with how they're going to address things by gender, they talk about a lot of STEM stuff. They don't talk about women in STEM. That's actually a typical program that is in most high schools in the state of Massachusetts. Women in STEM. They sort of don't talk about any specific program that they have at the statewide level. I don't know why, because they have them. And then they basically say that they're going to shove all the boys into the, basically continue using Kaleidoscope. Last I checked, Kaleidoscope wasn't just, this is almost sort of a cop-out to sort of say that, oh yeah, we have this sort of way about doing things for girls. We have this way about doing things for boys. We have this way about doing stuff for non-binary. But really, because look, Kaleidoscope Collective for Learning Network, and then they talk about deeper learning. They are not differentiating. I mean, there's a lot of, oh, and look, they do use Kaleidoscope later down. They're not really doing, they're doing superficial differential support. They're not really, it's strange. And I think really what this just highlights is just sort of the issues with postmodernism, where everything is different, but everything is, stays the same, sort of. It's just, and we keep going, IEP development and stuff. I'm not going to speak to IEP. Marilyn Muller does a lot of stuff pro bono in, at the local level and at the more national level with this kind of stuff, talking about it. She's a Massachusetts resident. And she's going to tell you that Massachusetts is totally trash when it comes to how it does its IEP programs. I have personally seen enough of how bad it is in the Massachusetts public schools that I will just tell you that whatever they're claiming here is probably totally a waste of public resources, because they're not very effective at it. And anything that they say, they basically double back on and say, well, we really can't even do that. There's no accountability. And then they go back to their stakeholder engagement, which is really just anecdotal bias or anecdotal feedback. Wraparound services. Let's just kind of go over what is a wraparound service. Wraparound service is something that's sort of, if you're going to do reading, well, then a wraparound, I'm sort of not doing this correctly, but let's say that you're learning how to read something. Well, a wraparound service for how to read something, maybe access to literature, so you have a library, maybe access to a public library, or how to go to a public library so you get the lesson on the Dewey Decimal System. Apparently that's not the hot thing anymore, the Dewey Decimal System anymore. Actually, I should probably ask what is actually supposed to be used now, but I have no idea what the standard is being changed to. I feel so old saying that, but I also never expected the day that they would stop using the Dewey Decimal System. And then, of course, they talk about social emotional, and their wraparound definitions are using stuff like that. This is sort of 12 pages of it. I'm kind of going to go through this line by line to try an early indicator system. They use MCAS result early indicator system because remember everything in Massachusetts is centralized. These the early indicator system dependent on MCAS results to indicate whether or not there needs to be mandatory intervention that the state forces on the local district. This whole student learning time and the student information management system, they have information on all the students in the state, and that's differentiated and centralized. Not differentiated, but individualized and centralized. They have information on all the students in the state. Not necessarily all. They don't collect every piece of information that that the individual localities have, because some stuff, of course, is private information you can't really share with the state, but there's quite a bit of information that gets shared with them. Enrollment, attendance, they know their enrollment and attendance numbers almost on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. I forget how it gets reported to the state, but there's a state reporting system that attendance secretaries, and this is what they are called, they're called attendance secretaries or attendance assistants in the school districts in Massachusetts, whose only job, well, it's not their only job. It's usually the same people who are just at the normal reception desks anyway. But when you first go into a school, like the school secretaries or the school front desk assistants, but they are the people who are responsible for reporting this stuff to the state or collecting that from all of the teachers' classrooms and then reporting it to the state. Safely reopening schools. All the schools were mandatory to be opened. You're going to see this. Each state has its own version of FEMA. This one's called MEMA. I'm just pointing this out as like a government thing. So the response to COVID-19 changed fairly, basically has been happening sort of, you can look at the specific guidance, but this stuff is like totally not, unless it links to, where's it linked to? I think that actually links to like an updated website that they update with, but what was supposed to be, and this is why they're also kind of vague in here, and they do a lot of links when they know that they're going to change a lot of stuff. When this document was released and when it was submitted, DESE didn't want to have anything to do with masking at the state level. And then August came, like late August. At that point, my school district had already voted on masking, and it had basically been thrown out, much to the chagrin of some of the people on the school committee, because it was a very close vote on a 4-3. It was more on a 4-2, because it was we're an 8-person committee, 7 of us showed up. It's an 8-person committee. 1 person had left. They had resigned. They were in the process of resigning, but they just didn't show up to that meeting, but they were still available. So they didn't show up to that meeting. So we were 1 member down. Then a second member had to leave before we got to that point. So then we were down to 6 people. And then it was a 3-3 vote on the first vote for basically keeping the DESE or doing something with a masking policy, and we basically shot that down, and then we basically on a 4-3 revoked the existing masking policy. And then DESE voted, put in masking guidance, and then we came back and said, oh, we got to have a policy again, which I basically was like, I'm not doing that. We said no, and if the state wants to do it, fine. They can tell, you know what, it's, the law, we're a centralized education agency. There isn't a lot of local control. Then fine, that's the rule of the land. We really don't need a backup rule for it. People disagreed with me. In anticipation of my arguments, because I didn't say a whole lot, they clearly brought out all of the teaching staff as an attempt to, and I will say this, they were trying to manipulate me into saying yes. They didn't like that I said no. They wanted a unanimous vote on a policy. And I was like, I'm not giving it to you, because if you're begging me this much for this much control, something is deeply wrong, because there's plenty of policies in the policy handbook to deal with these sort of situations when there's a difference between the state and the locality. Nope, you got to have a masking policy. No. But it passed on I want to say it was a 5-1 vote, and I was in the minority in that who said no. People were very sort of passionate towards me. And then I think they very quickly realized they probably shouldn't be so passionate with me, because I was making quite a bit of sense. But it wasn't looking good for them. And one of my, and I wish I had drove it home back then on this. What I should have said was, you know, we don't need a policy, but I think I had said it at the public meeting. But one of the things that maybe I didn't say in the public meeting, but that I was really thinking about, was the fact that I was supposed to be on the policy subcommittee. So I had actually went for almost the entire policy handbook at least once for a read through, and I was going back through it to see what we were doing currently and updating stuff. And you can see the past versions of things, and you can see the current versions of things when you're a school committee member, and you can log in and see the policy handbook. So I looked at it, and one of the things that I picked up really quickly was that policies don't get eliminated. I've even looked at the Massachusetts recommended policies guidebook from the Massachusetts Association of School Committees, also known as MASC. And MASC basically, through their programs and stuff, I'm trying to think off the top of my head about MASC. Basically, they don't really delete stuff. The policies bloat out, and it gets more and more over-regulatory at the local level and at the state level. And I don't know if I made the point, but I wanted to make the point that in the history of the district, we have never revoked a policy. And I knew when that policy got revoked, that was going to be the only time that a masking policy was ever going to get revoked from the district. I don't think all of the states adopted policies, all of the localities and the regional and the local school districts adopted policies after that about masking. I don't think in the state of Massachusetts that they're ever going to get revoked. I don't think there's going to be a rescission vote for any of those, and I don't think that any of those rescission votes are going to pass anytime soon. Even in 2 to 3 years from now, quite frankly, I just don't see this going well. And even if they do, I don't think they'll rescind it, but there's a lot of power in the particular sections that were drafted and created. And I think what they're going to do is, if they do eliminate the policy, someone's going to keep in a back book the specific language used in that, and you're going to see it readopted into other sections, not necessarily for masking, but for other things. And so I just want you to be aware that this whole conversation with the similar language being used in policy handbooks in the state of Massachusetts and in others, it's not going to go away anytime soon. The language and the philosophy has now been introduced to these committees. They are not going to want to throw it to the wayside. And the administrators like the power. Quite frankly, it's addicting, or they're afraid and they like the power so that they can, feel protected for themselves. Even though the state gave them the power to do it anyway. It was just, but that is just sort of my response on that. Claiming and maintaining healthy facilities. I didn't get much farther than this because I was reading and looking a lot at the other stuff, but we're going to kind of go through this. Department track monitors districts, reopening efforts, department consultation, BINEX. Now they're just going over the exact plan. They use the BINEX now, rapid antigen test, blah, blah, blah. It's the whole thing that's kind of brought in everyone anxiety in the state. And that really puts a strain on our limited resources in terms of being able to provide proper education in the state, because most time people are wasted, being shoved between, are you going to go home or you're not going to go home, or, any number of other things. The department will systematically, ensure that the layers receive ARP ESSER funds, meet the requirements of Section 2001 of the ARP Act. I'm going to have to do I don't know if I should do it as a streamer. I'm going to have to do it as like a standalone video, because, and I've said this a few times, going through these plans is very important, because you need to learn how all these states are trying to figure out how to put really bad stuff into the districts and push a political narrative through the ARPA money. But at the same time, you also need to understand what's actually allowed in ARPA, and that is the school sections, and I've been having a hard time trying to explain this to certain people. Excuse me, I have a tickle on my throat because I've been talking for 55 minutes. All right, we're fine now. People need to understand that there's a lot in the ARPA plan, in the American Rescue Plan Act. But the way that the Treasury Department and the way, maybe the Treasury has been very unclear about this, but the way that the federal government and the state governments are treating the Education Stabilization Fund portion of this with respect to everything else is it's a separate thing. What one may think that you can do that you can't do at the locality level, like in a town or a city, you can do with ARPA. And you could do with CARES Act funding, and you could do with with the ESSER 2 funding. You could, and it's explicitly allowed. It's explicitly allowed from ESSER 2 on, but it was sort of allowed in the CARES Act funding, the first round. You can hire new staff, and it says that you can do that in, Section 2001 and sequence. You can hire new staff. You can use it to avoid layoffs. You can put that money into existing positions. You can do all of that stuff. And federal law says that you can rather explicitly, and the federal guidance says you can do that rather explicitly. It's quite frankly on there, and I think I've pointed it out several times that it says that you can do that on this channel and on other channels. But it's its own entity. We're going through. This is the federal government's question. You know what? There's a lot in here. Governor's Secretariat. Oh my God. Oh, here we go. I'm only going to stay on for a few more minutes, but I really want to highlight this point. This is what. Oh, you're going to love this. These are the I'm going to highlight this. So the stakeholder groups that we did meet with over the course of May and June represent the interests. All of the interest rated above. These are all of their interests, like civil rights, affinity organizations, American Indian tribes, English learners, migratory students, teachers unions. Let's look at the exhaustive list in no particular order of the 50 stakeholder groups that were allowed to be in. And I will name all of them. The Massachusetts School Counselors Association, which gets state funding, the American Federation of Teachers of Massachusetts, the He Is Me Institute, the Teach Western Massachusetts, which I believe has state funding associated with it, the National Parents Union, the Massachusetts School Administrators Association, which gets money from the state, the Massachusetts Interscholastic Athletic Association gets money from the state, Higher Ground, School Facts Boston, which gets money from the state, Massachusetts Education Equity Partnership, don't know, but they, I'm going to tell you when I actually know that they get money from the state. The Massachusetts Association of Vocational Administrators gets money from the state. Immigrant Family Institute, Parent Villages, the Massachusetts Association of School Committees gets money from the state. DESE Teacher Advisory Council and the Principal Advisory Council. Latinos for Education, the Massachusetts Association of Educational Collaboratives, the Urban League, the Lawrence Community Works, Massachusetts Administrators of Special Education gets money from the state, Center of Education Services, the March Forward for Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Association of School Superintendents gets some money from the state, the EL English Learners Bilingual Advisory Council, the Ed Trust, the Massachusetts Advocates for Children, the Massachusetts Teachers Association, which gets money from the state, the Amplify Latinx, I guess that's how you say that, Boston Schools Fund, which gets money from the state. I don't know if the Boston Schools Fund gets money from the state, so I take that back. Massachusetts Association for Bilingual Education, the Parent and Community Education and Involvement Advisory Council, the Special Education Advisory Council, the Arts Education Advisory Council, Massachusetts Association of School Business Officials, I believe that's also funded from the state, the Teacher Collaborative, Teach Plus, the Teachers Lounge, Education Law Task Force, which I think gets money from the state, but I'm not totally sure about that one. Citizen Schools, the Worcester Educational Collaborative, You Aspire, the State Student Advisory Council, the Racial Imbalance Advisory Council, and yes, this does exist, and I have seen their meetings. And the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education counts as a stakeholder group. The group making the rules counts as a stakeholder group for the interests of the state. It's unbelievable. And the Massachusetts Parent-Teacher Association, which is very heavily associated with the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. They nominate people on a list for the governor that goes, and one of those people gets selected to be on the board. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. When I tell you about the stakeholder groups being like totally, but the input doesn't stop here. Massachusetts has several other stakeholder engagement sessions scheduled in the coming days and weeks. Yeah, with the same people. I think we're going to stop at page 20 because I can't keep going on this. I really don't want to. It's just unbelievable. It's truly unbelievable. I mean, I'm doing these videos not to try and get a lot of engagement on my channel. What I'm trying to do is lay a public groundwork for how you should start to look at this stuff and to look at what sections are important and to understand that there's a lot of background knowledge that you're going to need walking into reading these documents to truly understand how, and I will say this, that plan is corrupt and this is a problem. And a lot of officials don't understand what they're looking at. It's not, I am sorry, but racial difference shouldn't be taught in the classroom. It has nothing to do with anything. The only reason it works with the state's goals on education is because the state's goal on education in Massachusetts, not surprisingly, is to funnel more money into it. And so it makes the perfect case to funnel more money into schools that aren't working. I mean, we have several school districts in the state of Massachusetts that are the butt end of many jokes, including places like Lawrence, the Lawrence Public Schools, etc. It's just, I don't know. But anyway, I know that was a long and slow go through on this document, but I think we're going to have to, I'm going to go through the rest of it to see if there's any new points that need to sort of get made throughout the remainder of this document that I won't cover in another document about another one. I'll probably know if in the day or two what I'm going to do on that. But otherwise, expect another live at 9 next week. On Saturday at 9 o'clock, expect another either this or another state to get brought up that we're going to look at. So we can sort of pick apart what's going on in the state ESSER plan. And that's really all I have. It's my state, so I understand a lot about it. So hopefully I didn't overwhelm you with the knowledge and stuff that I was trying to explain about the background situations and the way that we interact. I know there was a lot of back end to this that I wasn't totally focused on the document itself. But there's a lot of stuff that the document talks about that evolved very rapidly. That wasn't followed through on very well. And there's a lot of stuff that's not followed through on even right now. And there's a lot of bad stuff in there. And there's a lot of stuff that nobody even understands about that's really bad. And I know I'm overusing the word bad in this situation, but the words corrupt, bad, gross have been so cheapened because of how bad, corrupt, and gross some of these plans are, that it's unbelievable what we're dealing with right now. It's truly unbelievable. But I think I'm going to leave it there. I've been going at this for almost 65 minutes. So I'm Justice Graves. This is my channel. Please go to my channel at justicegraves.locals.com. If you want to go to my locals group, not my channel, my locals group, please like, share, and subscribe if you like this content, and share it with your friends. Talk about it as much as you want. And I think I'm just going to try and end it here. Have a good rest of your night or whenever you're watching this, and I'll see you again soon. If I don't post another regular video out on my channel, then I will see you live at 9 next week, and we will cover whatever state, if we're going back to Massachusetts again, or if we're going to a different one. If I go to a different one, it's probably going to be North Carolina this time, just because there isn't a need to go with the New England states if it's going to be like this every single time. So I'm probably going to go with North Carolina on the next one. And these are not good, clearly. But that's all I have to say. Like, share, and subscribe for this content again, and see you next time. Bye.